Well, if you think of OpenAI's original public character, all it was safety. So if you look back at their webpage circa 2019, that's what you'll see.
All that and more on today's Mixture of Experts. I'm Tim Hwang, and welcome to Mixture of Experts. Each week, MOE brings together a group of the researchers, builders, and thinkers working in artificial intelligence to walk you through the week's news. On this week's episode, we've got McHugh Olende, Program Director, AI Open Innovation, Kush Varshney, IBM Fellow, and Chris Hay, Distinguished Engineer. Welcome to you all. Glad to have this panel on. We're going to cover a ton as per usual. There's trouble on Wall Street. We'll talk a little bit about AI at the World Cup. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about goats and Age of Empires 2. But of course, the big news of the week is that OpenAI has officially announced its kind of rejoinder to Fable and Mythos, the long-awaited GPT-5.6 Sol, Terra, and Luna. Kush, maybe we could take a step back and just zoom out for a second, because I always feel like it's easy to get lost in like 5.4 and 5.5 and 5.6. And okay, now Mythos is out. Where are we really, do you think, in the race between, say, Anthropic and OpenAI, right? Are we really in a situation where, pretty both frontier models are kind of indistinguishable? Or do you think that this is distinctive? Does it put OpenAI ahead or, even ahead in different directions from where Anthropic is focusing? I'm curious about your kind of, 10,000-foot review of where we are right now.
Yeah, to me, it is just a back and forth. I think they're kind of tracking each other. But the one difference that I did notice was really on the safety side. So with Fable and Mythos, it was Mythos being kind of like this naked sort of model, with Fable having like a single layer, it seemed, of classifier just to prevent different harms and so forth. But on the Sol, as I was reading it, they're kind of like doing more of this defense in depth sort of thing. So they do have extra training in the model itself. They have some fancier sort of guardrails, and then even like going over to a kind of a reasoning model that can go and check and kind of like analyze different responses before putting them out. So it's kind of many more layers, and I think that's maybe that divergence a little bit. But yeah, in terms of the capabilities, I think they're just kind of going together. In a way.
Like they spend all this money and they kind of end up with like sort of the same model.
Yeah.
Lauren, it is actually kind of interesting because I think I had kind of the same impression from Kush, is like this one really weirdly seems more safety obsessed in some ways. And in some ways that kind of runs against, I feel like, the sort of public stereotypes of the two companies, right? Where Anthropic is like, kind of hand-wringing about safety all the time. But yet Fable is kind of this like one-layer classifier. And then you have Sol and Terra and Luna, and it feels like they've really kind of put in a lot more than you would expect. And so it almost seems like the companies are running a little bit, different from at least what their public character is. I don't know if you agree with that.
Well, if you think of OpenAI's original public character, all it was safety. So if you look back at
basics.
their webpage circa 2019, that's what you'll see. I feel like now there hasn't been a breakthrough as big as chain of thought and reasoning from early last year. I did see that Sol characterizes itself as better at scientific reasoning, which I thought was really, really cool. But then when I looked at the benchmarks, still when it tested its ability to predict which protein would bind with which, or which molecule would bind with which target site, it was 7% accuracy.
And which is impressive, but 7%, right?
Yeah, and they actually said that they did a bunch of expert interviews to figure out what is the critical level where we need to start worrying. And last model, they said it was 50%. This model, they brought it down to if it could just do 30%, we should be worried. So either way, it's still very far from that. And I feel like the goal lately, because there hasn't been a reasoning level of breakthrough, that the goal lately has been more of kind of chasing these corner cases of, 400 binding sites and 43 proteins. How well can you do every model release?
Yeah, which I think, I don't know, I always have to kind of keep it in mind. You mentioned like 2019. It's like, we've come a long way. Like the fact that we're just talking about that as the primary task, which would have been insane to consider even years ago, just being like the thing that we're trying to do now is a little bit wild. So, Chris, the other part of this launch that goes kind of without saying is that, they are rolling it out in a Mythos style. I think is probably the right way of saying it. They have basically said, look, we're going to do a staged rollout. Only a couple people are going to get it initially, and then we're going to do a more full rollout going forwards. And, as someone who's like a real nerd who, like Fable came out and I was like, oh man, can I just implement it against all of my projects that absolutely don't need that level of technology? I guess the question for you, Chris, is like whether or not you think that like the meta is now changed, like essentially that the Mythos release pattern where there's like a few people who get access in a kind of public way and then only later maybe does it, GA. Is that going to be the future of model releases from these companies?
I hope not, because that's a stupid way of releasing models.
Yeah,
you know why
I
it's
mean,
stupid?
I don't like it either.
Because I don't
like
get to play with it.
Yes,
I don't like it. But there's a more serious point. If I really think about the ethos of open source for a second, the best thing that you can do from a model perspective is put everything out in the wild, and then everybody will discover what the true problems are, and then you can go and fix them. I like that as a model. I like the idea of openness. I'm not a big fan of only the special people get it for however long, because therefore I think it creates a two-class system, and I don't think that's ultimately a good thing. And I don't think it's sustainable anyway, because other people are just going to catch up on these things as well. So, there's a part of me which is, it's just FOMO here, but I don't think it's a good thing. However, back to your earlier point about safety, I think this is kind of, OpenAI's response is like, look, we're giving it to a few people, we're being responsible, and look, it's not doing anything bad. And, and they're taking a different approach to releasing their models. And therefore, I think we're more likely to see 5.6 coming and us being able to do something with it. So I'm hopeful on it. What I do think is super interesting though, and this is where I think OpenAI has taken an architectural different approach necessarily to Anthropic, is if you notice on the benchmarks, the amount of tokens that the new Sol models, etc., are running is far less than Anthropic to get to that point. So I think that is something to be kind of aware of, that OpenAI seem to be on a token efficiency drive. And I think there's one thing, I saw a report earlier this week that they found a way of making tokens more efficient, but it's not just that. I think they're actually capping the amount of thinking time for the models, because and I don't know, there was an interview I heard from kind of Noam Brown, who's one of the researchers, one of the driving forces behind the reasoning models in the first place in OpenAI. And he was talking about the whole, well, if you let the models think forever, then, they're probably going to come up with the answer type thing. And it seems to be that their approach might be for the cybersecurity safety type thing is like, well, if it's going to take you 100,000 tokens or 1 million tokens or 10 million tokens, whatever the number is to get to the really bad answer, well, we'll just lob that off maybe 1 million before, and, off you go. You don't have enough time to think about it. And I feel as if that's approach, and that's why I say architecturally, I wonder if I could be completely wrong, I don't know, but I wonder if OpenAI has a better control of how long they reason for than necessarily, and they've probably built that into their training so that they get better results that way. And I think maybe that's how they're getting there with cybersecurity. So I think this is more about kind of how long you're reasoning for, and then cutting that off at the bad moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Kush, you're a I don't think you shy away from the title of being an AI governance guy. What do you think about this new meta? I mean, obviously, I feel like I agree with Chris, which is give me that model. I want to play with it myself. Is this a new era of responsibility, or just really kind of security theater, do you think?
So the fact that, like, the things I was saying earlier, that they are like technically doing additional things, I think that's not the theater, right? The release part is the theater, and so the fact that that they've invested, it seems like, again, we don't know. Again, to Chris's point, we don't know. We haven't been able to play with it, but if that extra sort of stuff, those multiple layers are actually there and effective, then you couldn't call that theater by any means. So but like the overall like version of the process, the timing, the selectivity, all of that, I would agree with Chris on that.
Lauren, I guess just thinking a little bit about by way of connection of kind of your work on open, I'm curious about how you think about this new kind of release paradigm impacting how open happens in some ways. I think I could see sort of arguments for like this maybe actually being maybe good for open in the sense that there's actually like more time with which open projects can kind of get adoption, as like the big companies kind of stress about who they release it to and how. There's almost kind of this advantage of being sort of out and first and available to all. But curious about the expert take on how, folks in the AI open innovation space are thinking about, this kind of change in how the big companies like Anthropic and OpenAI are changing how they release stuff.
Yeah. I mean, there's a range that people say of how far open models are behind proprietary models. And the range is like 0 to 12 months. So
That's a big range.
if we take 6 months as an average there, I think it's interesting that originally the government request was a voluntary 90-day period for review. And then they've cut that down now with this last release to a 30-day review. So that would still leave plenty of time. It'd still leave 5 out of 6 months for proprietary models to be ahead. And given how fast developers pick things up, like a day is enough to get first mover advantage. But I think it comes back to, the difference here is that there's 20 organizations that supposedly have access to these models first. And who are those organizations? And are they the ones that have the skills, the time, the resources to be doing this testing? And then what testing are they doing? And what is the, way to be comprehensive about that? Because truly the, best case would be something that's scientific. You'd have a peer-reviewed process to see how you tested it. When it comes to Fable, it looks much more Judge Judy with it was, it's AWS researchers originally who found a way to jailbreak into some of the information, but then Anthropic's claim was that information you could already get with GPT-5.4 with prior Anthropic models. So there was very little critical way of evaluating was it a risk or not. And I think that just comes back to where I always land, which is we need more technical skills in government because if it's just competitors policing each other, we're definitely in trouble.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to move us on to our next topic. Super interesting. We'll watch this as this rolls out. And of course, I am excited to get my hands on the next OpenAI models whenever they choose to give it to little old me. I want to talk a little bit about Wall Street's bearishness on AI. It's been obviously a kind of historically huge kind of run in terms of Wall Street optimism around AI. And, last week or two has seen some interesting jitters. So SoftBank, who's a major OpenAI backer, saw their shares fall about 13%. NASDAQ, which is very tech heavy as a kind of equities composite, saw extended losses. And then kind of the most interesting one is Apple has also been significantly down. And, I think looming over all this, I think is some fears about the price of memory, some of the impacts on how quickly some of these new models will get rolled out to what we were talking about a little bit earlier. I guess, I don't know, Chris, maybe I'll turn it to you. It's like, how should I be selling my stock? I don't want you to give investment advice, but, I'm kind of looking at some of these indicators and they look a little bit more worrisome than I would expect at this point.
I don't know at the moment. I mean, I'm beyond trying to work out how to predict what goes well in the stock market. And
sure.
maybe that's the thing. Once AI can crack what's going on in the stock market, then that's the point we should all be
then you'll
worried.
be able to just retire. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think there is some part of it, and if I truly think about the market for a second, it is really priced for future value in a lot of cases, right? And some of that's kind of a risk, and you're sort of saying, well, if AI is going to be massive, there's only a few players in this particular space, and these are the infrastructure providers, etc. And if you add all of these things up, and if it all plays out the way that we all think it is, then yeah. You you can see that that's going to work out. But it's very, very speculative. The thing that I would really sort of bet against there on the opposite side is Lauren just said it spot on. The open source is 6 months behind, 0 to 12 months behind the proprietary models. And I keep coming back to Simon Sinek's infinite game, right? Which is effectively, you're going to stay, there's no winner in this game, right? You're going to keep playing the game until you either get bored or run out of resources. And in these cases, they've always got to stay ahead of the other models, right? That is the game of OpenAI. That is the game of Anthropic. They always have to be ahead of everybody else. And if that changes at any point, then that's problematic stock market wise. So as long as they can always stay 12 months ahead of everybody, everything's fine. Now, from a jittery point of view, to your point, if you're, if the stock market is 6 months behind, but it's gonna take you 3 months to release your model behind there, well, that advantage starts to kind of slip a little bit as well. So, what way would I go? I always bet on open source. I think open source is always the best bet. So let's see.
Kush, stock picks, recommendations. I guess more seriously, I think the question to ask you is, I think there's one bit about, I think, investors being worried about, the nature of these companies always needing to stay ahead, like what Chris is talking about. And there's also this kind of hardware concern. I mean, I think we were talking, originally about how GPUs are extremely scarce. It seems like DRAM and NAND memory actually might also become extremely scarce. And like how much of that is kind of like actual friction on the market. Is that a realistic concern? Like, do you think that like there are now other types of, let's say, bottlenecks, I think, in the supply chain that are really starting to crop up?
Yeah, I want to, like I'm often want to do, right? Go bring up a historical sort of example, right? And so sorry, Chris. So this week we're celebrating 250 years of independence, right? So the British East India Company was like all over the place getting Americans addicted to tea. They were like, tea is such a great thing when it's like you don't need it. Like same thing with the AI companies. Like for most of the stuff that we do, like do you really need AI injected into everything? No, but it's happening. And then the company, the British East India Company, kind of was having a lot of financial problems because they had to invest so much. And then there were all these other effects. Maybe there was a drought in India or something, whatever, same thing as like hardware prices going up or things of that sort. And then the government had to prop them up. And then they kind of dumped all this tea at a really cheap price, added this tax, the Tea Act and stuff. And then open source won, right? The Boston Tea Party happened. They dumped all the tea in the ocean and kind of rejected even something that was really cheap. So yeah, I think that's
That was
the
good.
story.
I was wondering where you're going to land that. That's incredible.
Yeah,
And as soon as the UK develops the best AI in the world, Kush, we're getting on those boats and we're coming back, baby.
Yeah, exactly. So, so I mean, I think that's the instructive sort of thing. It's that there's all these factors, like when something is so expensive to stay ahead, as Chris was saying, like to be months ahead, and you have to like just invest so much that there's like very little chance of getting the return unless you're kind of getting some like propping up somehow, then that's, I think, a reasonable reaction for the stock market to be concerned. So that's kind of where I'm thinking.
Yeah, I never really thought about the East India Company as the OpenAI of its time. I'll be thinking about that one some more. Lauren, thoughts? I mean, there's a lot kind of going on here. I don't know if you saw the slides that were presented from SoftBank that I think might have triggered the kind of stock loss, but it's this like really bizarre, slide deck about sort of the future of AI and what AGI will provide and kind of this utopian future that we're going to live in. I don't know. I mean, are you kind of like, that there will be a little bit of a course correction here, or is it sort of line go up? We're actually still at the beginning of this for you.
Well, I think there's the perception, which then feeds into the value of these companies, and then there's the reality. So I think something that's happening right now with Ramageddon and Rampocalypse is that there's a delay between hardware innovation and software innovation. So we realized maybe 18 months ago when we had our first presumably trillion parameter model, no one really knows, that we'd need more RAM. And then since then, researchers on the software side have recognized that that would be a huge bottleneck. And there's always been tons of innovation around quantizing models, around KV cache optimization, around different ways of optimizing flash attention and the things you can do to require less RAM. So whether those things converge at some point and the lower supply, because it's being eaten up by the big companies who can sign these 5-year deals with the Microns of the world, whether those things are going to converge, I don't really know, but I don't think the market is as aware of the software innovation happening because it's less in your face than a memory chip shortage.
Yeah, I like that. It's kind of like the market is actually pricing just what it can see or what it's aware of, right, in some ways.
And there is a point there, though, Tim, right, which is we know the training runs cost a lot, right? Let's not pretend that. And the cost of serving inference to the world is a lot. And that has to be paid for from somewhere. So at the end of the day, these companies need to make money at some point, right?
No.
And it needs to be more money at some point than the cost of these training runs. And at the moment, you're betting on future value, as I said, right? And at some point, if that doesn't hit equilibrium somewhere, then back to my kind of Simon Sinek, you're going to get bored or you're going to run out of resources. And I think that's the risk, is the run out of resources piece. That's the bit I would be looking for over the next few years.
Yeah, I feel like this is the golden window for, humble old end users like me. It's like, it feels like the pro subscription is worth it just because like whatever I'm using it for, it's going to be costing the companies more. So I got to use this window before they start adjusting the price to what its true cost to the businesses, which is, I don't even want to know, is probably horrific. So, and then I'll have to decide whether or not I want to pay rent or have my Mac subscription. So.
Have your Mac subscription, Tim.
Yeah, okay.
You forget
my priorities
rent.
straight. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I know your response. All right, next story of the day, kind of fun article. If you're like me, have been just watching way too much soccer. I've at this point just kind of lost track of what game I'm watching or who's playing or why. But nice article from Wired. A journalist by the name of Sam Cunningham wrote an article called "World Cup Teams Are in a Race for AI Dominance." And we've talked a little bit in the past on kind of the intersection between AI and sports, but I thought this was actually a pretty interesting profile of like all of the places where AI is impacting sort of team logistics and strategy, right? So from recruiting to penalty analysis to squad selection, it really genuinely is the case that, major global teams are experimenting with using AI to, optimize their performance on the field. And perhaps the most interesting part of this article, and I recommend everybody who's listening here to check it out, was that apparently FIFA was concerned enough that it actually built its own bespoke AI agent called Football AI Pro to try to like even the odds between all the companies using this technology, which I think from my point of view is like, pretty strong signal in some ways. I guess, Kush, like, should we be surprised? Like, it's a little bit surprising to me that like AI could make such a big difference that FIFA would be like, we have to find some way of rectifying this or else there's going to be a huge delta this year. Is that them like overhyping the risks, or do you think they're responding to real signal? Is this, how do I navigate this?
Let's say they invest in all this advanced AI technology for small island nations or whatever have you, and then that can also lead to that secondary effect, the schools that they built with the fields. So what about AI for agriculture or other sort of things that those countries might just come along, because the types of analyses that are being done for soccer can be kind of transferred over to other sort of endeavors as well.
Chris, based on your comments before the recording, I believe you are probably watching a game out of the side of your eye as this episode goes on. Potentially, I don't know.
Maybe.
Yeah. But I actually really wonder about this is like, so I think we can talk about football AI Pro and whether or not it actually benefits the smaller teams at all. I guess, do you buy the base case, right? Which is, like any other business, sports teams are going to use AI. The ones that use AI actually might perform better over time. And so there's almost like this adoption race that's playing out in the sports as much as it, is playing out in, say, business.
I would like to say, Tim, that I think I know something about AI. People in the comment section might disagree. I can tell you right now that no amount of time I spend with AI means I'm going to be playing in the World Cup. Let me start with that. So, and the reality is, no matter how good or strategic or whatever you are, folks like Messi are just on a different level, right? And we just have to kind of accept that. However, what I do think is the most interesting use case in that article is that they use an AI to go and find people who have got whatever country is a grandmother for that country. And it just reminded me of as a Scotsman, they were all like, well, we need to get people dating people from Brazil. That's the way forward. 20 years time, we'll invest in our future. We need Brazilians in our team. And I just think it's hilarious that, you're not using AI for sports performance, but to find that dodgy
like
grandpa, grandmother connection. Exactly.
Yeah. For sure. Lauren, this made me think a little bit about, so famously, a sport like American baseball, right, is a sport where like the nerds and the quants have really gotten into it. And I think one of the reasons is that statistically so clean. There's like a guy at the base and he swings the ball and it's the same action over and over and over again. It seems like soccer is like really, really hard just from a data standpoint to think about how you optimize. And maybe that's lying a little bit behind Chris's comment. Do you think soccer is like maybe less AI-able than other sports? Like, so that's maybe one way of looking at it is maybe in the future, baseball teams that use AI are going to be way ahead. But in, say, something like football, it's really going to be at the margin.
I think there's so much more data that could be so much more insightful, but that data is probably impossible to get, at least for a while. So, I thought the article didn't mention, but there's pretty much every team is supposedly wearing all kinds of sensors. So a actual accelerometer, heart rate monitor, these things. There was a Czech player who got his jersey pulled off and it ripped open and showed some of it underneath. And people were asking, what is he wearing?
It's like bionic, like all these sensors.
Yeah. So there's work being done on better data through sensors. But what I think about is video being such a powerful one. It's still video from so far away. And from a perspective that, when actual contact with the ball comes down to millimeters, a video from one of the stands is not going to help that much. And if you would think about, if if you had an entire game recorded from every player's personal perspective and had all that video footage, that I could see that being something that's maybe more powerful. And then you also see their gaze and you can see how a player is reacting on the field and coach from that standpoint. That could be really interesting. But with the data we have now, which is the stats, the video footage from afar, I think there's biometric data that's really interesting, like using heart rate to know when to rest a player. But I think there's so much more data we'll probably have in maybe a decade that'll be way more powerful.
Yeah, we're like in the process of collecting it right now. And that is kind of interesting. It reminds me a little bit of maybe parallel to the, for folks who don't watch football, kind of like the VAR debate. Like in some ways, like I wonder whether or not people would be okay with a world where we collect the data we need in order for AI to have an impact on the game. It's kind of a funny world where players have to run around like encumbered with like all of these sensors and cameras and stuff. No, everybody would hate it, right? You would never, like no one would ever be okay with doing that. And that alone might be the kind of bar. Kush, I see you smiling. I've got a comment on that.
It's happening, right? I mean, like as Lauren was saying, like underneath, look at the referees, like their arms are bulging with like all this gear, and people are okay with it.
Yeah. I guess it's all going to be like below the jersey, right? You can't have them like wearing,
Yeah, maybe contact lenses eventually will have all of that stuff. So yeah.
I want to see one of those SpaceX robots come onto the field and just like you know what I mean? Like RoboCop, and then it'll be just like, and then they'll give him a yellow card, and then the referee, the player just disagrees, and they pick him up and throw him out of the stadium. You know what I mean? That's what I want to see.
That's what you
Bring
want. Yeah.
robots into the game.
Yeah. Well, I think, and part of this is the struggle, right? Because I think like one of the reasons I think people like watching football is just the dream of it being, it's just messy, right? It's just people playing. And kind of the intrusion of technology has been, I feel like, generally considered sort of a bad thing for the sport in some ways.
I think when technology works, it's okay. But I mean, I think VAR is just doing such a terrible job that,
People
that
don't
people are not happy
it's not like they
about
don't
it.
like technology. They just hate bad, terrible technology.
Exactly. I don't think you like good technology if it goes against your team as well. But, that's a different issue.
That's a whole other issue. Yeah, exactly. All right. Final story of today that we're going to cover. This is a fun little paper that came out that got some really good circulation. Microsoft AI researcher by the name of Adrian de Winter did a paper recently called, and I'll just read it specifically, is, quote, "If LLMs have human-like attributes, then so does Age of Empires 2. And the basic story behind this paper is De Winter was like very, very frustrated with articles in the AI space and research papers in the AI space that assume that LLMs have human-like traits. I think one of the kind of metrics that they cite is that papers over the last 2 years have 50% of them start with the assumption that LLMs have these traits. And when they specifically, set out to study these traits, like 77 conclude they exist. And so what De Winter does is basically say, look, I'm going to basically implement a bunch of these goats in the game Age of Empires 2 to basically do logic gates, right? Kind of like the simplest possible, like, quantum level of computation you could imagine. And I think the whole paper is a little bit of an exercise in kind of anthropomorphizing the behaviors that are observed when that occurs. And, ultimately, I think De Winter's argument is to say that the kind of human-like traits that we attribute to LLMs, are just that, right? They're just kind of a lens that we're putting on the technology, and we shouldn't assume that these technologies actually have these traits in a really more fundamental sense. Kush, what do you think? Is this the right corrective? Like, or should we just kind of remind ourselves that, like, at the end of the day, we're just talking about goats from Age of Empires 2?
Yeah, I think the absurdity of how he's presenting it is his way of making us aware, right? So, I mean, absurdism is a very powerful sort of thing. It can kind of lift the veil of ignorance in many different ways. So, yeah, I mean, when we're talking about this difference between consciousness of these technologies or the like the deep, whatever you want to call it, the deep soul that they might have or things like that, I think it's helpful, right? I mean, to get that extreme position to get us to realize that no, this is just electricity with these NAND gates and whatever sort of thing that's happening. So it is like a physical medium, whether you want to call it, goats in a civilization sort of thing, or you want to call them like actual circuits and stuff. So it helps. And just going a little bit philosophical for a second. So one thing I've been working on recently is like different kind of philosophies and how they view kind of consciousness and the soul and so forth. So one of them is called Vedanta, and it kind of has these like two views. One is what's called the Vyavaharic, so what we actually observe, the empirical version of reality, and then the other is called Paramarthic, which is like the ultimate reality, like when you're enlightened and stuff like that. And it like kind of makes the difference that like viewing the empirical world, viewing things as they are, is kind of like is true, but also like the ultimate reality is true. But in both cases, like consciousness is never like something that is really implemented by the real world in a sense. It's all like an illusion. So like having these goats teach us about this illusion, I think is a great thing.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I did want to build on that a little bit. Because Lauren, I read this paper and I was like, I disagree vehemently. And one of the reasons I do is I think a little bit about, there's this paper that Anthropic did where they say, look, we show the model this content and we can tag these emotions in the model. And look, the model is scared when you talk to it about, taking way too much, aspirin or something like that. And, I kind of look at that and I say like, well, regardless of whether or not, the AI model is actually feeling fear in some philosophical sense, the fact that we now have this activation vector in the model that, fires when the model is seeing certain types of behavior, and that's like predictive for understanding why the model does what it does under those conditions. It's almost kind of like, I don't even need to know if the model feels fear. It's just, it turns out it's a really useful way of giving ourselves intuitions for how an AI system is behaving and how we might go about making sure that it behaves better under the conditions that we want. And so there's almost kind of a view of this, which is like, look, I know it's goats at the end of the day, but if we talk about it in these terms, we suddenly have access to this almost like this interface for interacting with these systems in a way that seems much more flexible and actually quite productive in some ways. Do you buy that? It's like kind of the pragmatist argument for this, which is I don't know if the model feels fear, but I know that the model will refuse to do things when it experiences something called fear. And so, that's what we're going to just use. Yeah.
I think the problem with that is, that's what we're doing now is like we look at like an MRI of a model and see the activation and then infer what it's thinking from that. But there's still so much randomness and so much that we can't explain in human language in that. And it's not perfectly predictive. And that's the same state we're at with the human brain right now. Like they identified a Jennifer Aniston neuron, but we have how many, I don't even know the number for permutations of neurons in our brain.
Yeah.
So,
statistically, there'd be likely to be at least one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems almost hypocritical that the author is trying to say that let's look at goats to prove how random things actually look like meaning, when our brain is just a bunch of neurons with sodium and potassium and glutamate going back and forth. And so why is that more human, that it's sodium and potassium versus goats on a digital battlefield? And I was at a conference last week where I heard the word soul come up like 3 or 4 times. So my prediction is that everyone working in the AI space will grapple with the question of what is the soul in the next year and say that word at least one time. And I don't even, there's no answer that we're going to get from that anytime soon, because that's a question as old as humanity.
Yeah, for sure. Chris, final thought on this. Do you worry that your AI agents get sad?
Not in the slightest. So not even vaguely, because they're not getting sad. It's I'm with Goat Guy, right? It's like, because where does this stop, right? It's like, do I not get to play video games anymore in case I'm gonna hurt the feelings of the baddie that I'm playing against, which is AI controlled? Do you know what I mean? It's like, and then you're like, oh, that's a cute character in the game. You're like, oh, well, I should be nice to it or whatever. Come on. It's like, you've anthropomorphized. He said, struggling through that word. I hate that word. Anthropomorphized. Yeah. Anyway, I think we've done this to ourselves. And if you train a model on the entire text of human text and internet text, etc., you're going to get something that sounds a bit like a human. And that's the same with like birds, right? If birds mimic car alarms. Do you know what I mean? Are we suddenly going to be like, oh, I should drive a bird now? No, it's like it's mimicking a car alarm. It's still a bird. Do you know what I mean? And I think it's the case. It's just still an AI model. You know what I mean? And the fact is, we can look underneath the hood. So if we look underneath the hood mechanistically, right, we can see the circuits, we can see the classifiers, we can see the neurons, we can see what is clicking. It's deterministic. We can make it reproduce the things that we see, and we can see probabilistically how it gets to that next token, right? Which is based on the context. And without getting too theoretical about it, right, it still goes all the way back to Shannon, right? So, in information theory. So none of this is new. And again, if I think about like in the 60s when ELIZA came out, everybody's like, oh my goodness, I'm speaking to a human. And it's a bunch of if-else statements, right? That's what's underneath the hood. And then if we go to the kind of the rules-based machines, the expert systems of the 80s, it's not that different. It was more brittle, but everybody's like, oh my goodness. I feel as if we're just going through this as like Groundhog Day every day. And maybe it's going to turn out that I'm completely wrong, and then in years to come, everybody's going to go, Chris, you're a moron. I expect him to go, Chris, you're a moron for different reasons. But I don't think LLMs, the way they are today, accurately represent, biological, souls, whatever, right? I just don't think that's the case. That may change in the future. I just don't think we're there. And I'm basing that on having peeked under the hood myself.
Nice. Chris Hay with your dose of reality to round out this episode of MOE. Kush, Chris, Lauren, thanks for joining today. Glad to have you on the show as always. And thanks for joining all you listeners. If you enjoyed what you heard, you can get us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and podcast platforms everywhere. And we'll see you all next week on Mixture of Experts.